Hey, welcome to The Realm. Today we're going to be taking a look at capitalism and socialism and a little bit of communism. And the title in the text is Reforming the Industrial World. And we're going to be talking about some of the philosophers and philosophies of the industrial world. First up is going to talk about laissez-faire economics. Talk about some of the key ideas here. Laissez-faire is an economic policy of letting owners of industry and business set their own working conditions without interference from the government. Basically, laissez-faire is a French term that means let do or let the people do as they please. It favors a rather free market with less government control, especially in the economic sector. Enlightenment economic philosophers believe that a laissez-faire approach of free trade, where there is flow of commerce without government regulation, would lead to economic prosperity. Adam Smith was a key thinker during this time. He was a professor at the University of Glasgow, Scotland. He defended the free market in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, which was based on the following principles of his ideology, which included the three natural laws of economics. The first law, according to Smith, was the law of self-interest. This is the idea that people work for their own good. The second law is the law of competition. He believed that competition forced people to make a better product. And third is the law of supply and demand. This basically is a key economic principle where the price of a said good is based on both the supply of the good and, of course, the demand of the good. When demand is high and supply is low, the price is going to be high. When demand is low and the supply is high, then the price will obviously be much lower. When I introduce this concept in class, I generally liken it to some of the new video games that come out. When PlayStation 5 first came out, probably sold for $550 or $600, something along those lines. See, the supply of those PlayStations was low, but the demand was very high. Everybody wanted to get a new PlayStation, but there was a limited supply. So people were literally on wait lists trying to get that. As it cools down over the course of the next few years, you will see the supply of PlayStation 5 start to increase, and you will see people's demand for the PlayStation 5 start to decrease, and so then you will also see the price start to decrease. The law of self-interest, people work for their own good. I would say that I can tell you as a teacher, I love my job, but I don't think that I could show up and teach every day if I wasn't getting paid. I have to get paid to take care of my family. So I think that this law is pretty important because I think people do in general work for their own good. Now, some people do volunteer. And some people, if you're following the ways of Christ, you'll give up your material possessions and follow God. But when you're talking about work, you're generally talking about getting paid, which would in turn end up meaning for your own good. The law of competition is as it's stated. I mean, when you have 4 gas stations on the corner, what's going to draw people into that spot? Is it going to be what's inside the mini mart? Is it going to be simply the price of gas? What is it? Is it the quality of the gas? So there's competition, whereas if you see gas at one corner for $2.49 and at the other corner for $2.50, you might see a couple more cars going into the one that's charging $2.49. And you could apply this to other business areas and realms as well. Next, let's take a look at the concept of capitalism, which we've learned about in the past. Some of the key ideas here. Smith's beliefs were fortified by 2 British economists, Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo. Now, they believed that natural laws did govern economic life. One of those ideologies comes into play as capitalism. It's an economic system, of course, in which the factors of production, things like land, labor, and capital, are privately owned, and money is invested in business ventures to make a profit. Now, there were 2 theories on population growth that apply to the idea of capitalism here. Thomas Malthus wrote an essay on the principle of population in 1798. He states that population would increase more rapidly than the food supply, and so therefore people needed to be careful because the population growth could lead to starvation. David Ricardo wrote a book called The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation in 1817. He believed that a permanent lower class would always be poor, and population growth will actually reduce wages for workers. Now, laissez-faire philosophers and economists in general did not support a minimum wage or better working conditions because they simply thought that it would reduce production and lower profits. So the next concept is going to focus on socialism. And we'll talk about the rise of socialism with socialist philosopher or philosophy first. Socialists believe that the government should actually actively intervene in business and create better conditions for workers. One of the examples of the socialist philosophy became known as utilitarianism. This was created by an English philosopher named Jeremy Bentham in the 1700s. He believed that people should judge ideas, institutions, and actions on the basis of their utility or usefulness. John Stuart Mill was another utilitarian. He led a movement of utilitarianism in the 1800s. He questioned unregulated capitalism. He wanted workers' rights, women's rights, and fewer differences in wealth among people. Utilitarianism wanted to reform the legal system, prisons, and education as well. You also have Robert Owen, who was from Scotland. He was a British factory owner, and he created better working conditions for his workers in cotton mills. What he did is built homes on site so that people could rent them at a cheap price. He prohibited children from working and provided free schooling for those children during the day while their parents would be working in the cotton mills. In 1824, he eventually moved to the United States, where he created a city called New Harmony, Indiana. Owen wanted this community to be such a utopia style or a perfect living place. Next, we'll talk socialism. When you take a look at the definition of socialism, you want to think about it in comparison to capitalism. In socialism, the factors of production are owned by the public, that means by the government, and operate for the welfare of all. So the factors of production, things like land, labor, and capital, are owned by the government and then dispersed to the people. This is much different than capitalism. Capitalism, the land, labor, and capital are privately owned. Okay. So socialists believe that the government should actually actively plan the economy, and they did not support the free market system. They thought that government control of factories, mines, railroads, and other key industries would end poverty and promote equality. Now we'll take a look at an extreme form of socialism, which is called Marxism or communism. And we'll talk about the Communist Manifesto, which was authored by Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx. This book, this ideology, argued that human societies have always been divided into two warring classes, the haves and the have-nots. According to Marx, the haves are known as the middle class, the bourgeoisie, or the capitalists. The have-nots, according to Marx, are the workers, or what he called the proletariat. Marx and Engels felt that the Industrial Revolution had actually made the wealthy more wealthy and the poor poorer. Marx predicted that workers would eventually overthrow the owners of factories in a famous quote, "Working men of the world, unite." Let's take a look at the future according to Marx. This is what Marx believed in the mid to late 1800s. Marx believed that workers would eventually overthrow the factory owners. He believed they would take over factories, that they would share in the profits of the factories, and bring economic equality to all people. If this were to happen, a classless society would have developed, and Marx called this pure communism. Communism is basically a complete form of socialism where the means of production would be owned by the people. Everything would be shared equally. In the 1900s, Marxism and Marxist thought influenced the following areas and their leaders: Russia, China, and Cuba. Today, there remain several countries that practice communism: North Korea, Laos, Vietnam, Cuba. And we move on into Roman numeral 4, labor unions and reform laws. Let's talk about this. This comes out of this reform of the industrial world. Unionization became something that happened. Unions are voluntary labor associations that workers would join together in. Unions will represent all of the workers in a particular trade or job. The union would bargain for better working conditions and higher pay. This is known as collective bargaining. And if they didn't get the conditions or the pay through collective bargaining, then those workers in the union would go on strike. A strike is where workers would refuse to work if factory owners would refuse the demands of collective bargaining. So basically, they go on strike, so nobody's working in the factories. Sometimes we've seen it where in Detroit City, for example, the Detroit newspapers went on strike one time when I was a young child. And basically what happened is we had workers that signed up to fill those jobs while the actual workers in the unions were on strike. And they faced quite a bit of criticism when they were driving into work. The actual newspaper workers would be throwing things at them, shouting at them, maybe banging on their cars, so on and so forth. So they were called scab workers. And so strikes, they can be pretty effective and they can be fairly controversial. But one of the reasons why people would go on strike, gents, would be because you can understand possibly that some of the conditions were not all that great. And so we will actually take a look at that up in this picture here. This is like what a coal mine looked like. They used to use many small children and women who could fit in the mine caves. And they worked pretty harsh style. So these are some of the reasons why reforms and strikes and unions actually came into play back then. Many laws were actually made to restrict or ban unions in England and even in the United States, something called the Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800. But after about 1825, most government systems in England began to tolerate unions. In the United States, several unions actually joined together into one large union of workers called the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL. They began to earn higher wages, better working conditions, and shorter hours due to successful strikes. So once again, strikes historically in the early 1800s had some effectiveness, and they can still be effective today. Capital letter B says reform laws, and we're going to talk about some of the acts that were passed and what years they were passed, and just maybe a few ideas of what they were meant to do. First of all is the Factory Act of 1833. Some of the stipulations on the Factory Act include that you couldn't hire children under the age of 9. If there was a child that was working that was between 9 and 12 years old, they definitely had to work 8 hours or less. And then as people progressed, age 13 to 17, they had to work 12 hours or less. This is per day, by the way, which 8-hour workday is pretty much the norm today. 12-hour workday is definitely a long day for a 13 to 17-year-old. Next is the Mines Act of 1842. As I said earlier, they would use children and women to go into mines. This is one of the reasons why unions and strikes came into play. But women and children were prohibited from working underground after 1842. Then you have the 10 Hours Act in 1847. This limited women and children to 10 hours of work in factories per day. And then you finally have the National Child Labor Committee, the NCLC, in 1904, which officially ended child labor. Today, there are still child labor laws. You are restricted to how many hours per day you can work, especially during the school year. That does change during the summer months, but nonetheless, those are some laws that are still being revamped on a daily basis. Okay, finally, some of the ideas of reform spreads into other avenues, such as the abolition of slavery, which was led by William Wilberforce. In 1807, British Parliament ended the slave trade. They abolished slavery in the entire British Empire in 1833. The United States Civil War was eventually won by the Union in 1865, which in essence abolished slavery in the United States. Talk a little bit about women's rights. The Industrial Revolution actually offered females new work and wage opportunities. However, women and female workers generally made only about 1/3 of what men made in the same field of work. Educated women in Britain and the United States fought for women's rights. There was something called the suffragette movement, which they fought for voting rights. But Jane Addams is an example of this time period. She lived from 1860 to 1935. She built something called Hull House in Chicago, which is still standing. There's a picture of it down here. That's William Wilberforce, by the way. And Hull House, built by Jane Addams, was a place where female workers could live and enjoy a community of female support. Okay, finally, I wanted to just go into a little bit more depth on capitalism versus socialism. Okay, the economic system known as capitalism developed over several centuries, started in the late Middle Ages. Because of industrialization, though, and the way that it changed society, some people began to think that capitalism led to certain problems, such as the abuse of workers, like we sort of talked about today. They responded to that situation by developing a new system of economic ideals called socialism. This is a nice breakdown of some of the major differences. Let's go point by point here. First, capitalism. Individuals and businesses own property and the factors or means of production, which I said was land, labor, and capital, for example. In socialism, the community or the state, the belief is that they should own property and the means of production. In capitalism, progress results when individuals follow their own self-interest, which was a key tenet of the teachings of Adam Smith. In socialism, progress results when a community of producers cooperate for the good of all. In capitalism, businesses follow their own self-interest by competing for the consumer's money. Each business tries to produce goods or services that are better and less expensive than those of the competitors. Socialists believe that capitalist employers take advantage of workers. The community or state must act to protect workers. In capitalism, consumers compete to buy the best goods at the lowest prices. This competition shapes the market by affecting what businesses are able to sell. In socialism, they believe capitalism creates unequal distribution of wealth and material goods. A better system is to distribute goods according to each person's need. That's according to the socialists. Finally, in capitalism, they believe that the government should not interfere in the economy because competition creates efficiency in business. And in socialism, the final point states that an unequal distribution of wealth and material goods is unfair. A better system is to distribute goods according to each person's need. So you see a lot in socialism, distributing goods according to each person's need. Well, how do you really define that? Is that just basic necessity, or is that actually looking at the individual? And in capitalism, you see that, it's very competitive. So you might see some ways that they can exploit different areas.